Welcome to Fearless Podcasting Academy. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Dean. I've always lived in two worlds, one filled with the magic of storytelling and language, and the other wired with technology and innovation. And through the years of research and teaching and hands-on experience, I've been obsessed with one question: what makes a message truly resonate? And that's why I created the Fearless Podcasting Academy, where creators and entrepreneurs and change makers come to ditch self-doubt, amplify their voices, and build podcasts that demand attention. So whether you're launching your first episode or leveling up your platform, you're in the right place. Because when you learn to use your voice with confidence, you don't just start a podcast, you start a movement. This is Fearless Podcasting Academy.
Hi.
We're a little giggly because there has been a slight delay in recording, but this is a podcast about learning to podcast. So it seems very meta and fitting for this podcast to have like, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So Tatiana, am I saying your name right first?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Okay. Could you tell me a little, or tell us a little bit about you, please?
Sure. So I'm Tatiana. I am a first-generation Latina. I am a trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I specialize in helping women heal trauma and their nervous systems through holistic practices and a method called somatic experiencing, where you don't need to talk about your trauma or even remember your trauma in order to heal from it. We're working with the body and working towards completing survival responses that weren't completed at the time of the original perceived or actual threat. And we're really trying to change your physiology, rewire your nervous system so that you're not constantly functioning from a state of fight, flight, or freeze.
You have a podcast called She is Resilient, and it has such a powerful mission. So what inspired you to start that?
Yeah, so She is Resilient is my podcast where I talk all about trauma healing, somatic healing, holistic healing. I talk about my personal journey in healing my nervous system and healing my trauma. And then I have some amazing guests who we get real, we get vulnerable, we just get deep with sharing, their healing journeys and how they overcame their struggles. And so She is Resilient stemmed from wanting to share my story with the world. And I think that as a mental health professional, oftentimes people forget that therapists and coaches are human as well. And so, I wanted to show people that, yes, even though I'm on this other side of healing, and yes, you see me doing all of these wonderful things in my life, I wasn't always like this. And I wanted people to hear my story and hear how, we are all healing from something. We are all going through something. And I wanted to use my voice, my story, and other people who come on the podcast to share their stories to really inspire and educate and empower other people and really help other women not feel alone in their journeys, because I think that healing can feel so lonely and isolating, especially when it feels like you're maybe the only person in your circle, in your circle of friends or family that is doing the healing work. And so I really just wanted others to know, like, oh my gosh, there's somebody else who is going through something similar or who has gone through something similar.
Yeah, that there's light at the end. You can get to that end, or maybe end isn't the right word because I don't know if there's ever an end, but like a lighter point at least.
Exactly. 1000%, right? Like there is, I do like to say, like, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, right? Like it's not always going to be dark and gloomy, and we don't have to live in these states of survival for, our entire lives.
Yeah, definitely. So cool. So many podcasters, you talked about how you went through this journey yourself before you started this podcast. And a lot of podcasters really struggle with imposter syndrome when starting out. Did you have any doubts or fears about launching your own show and being so vulnerable and talking about this?
Oh my gosh, 1000%. Yes. Yes, I have a long history of trauma and putting that out there into the world for people to know me so vulnerably, right? So like they know my story. That felt really exposing and scary for people to know. And I think that as a therapist, I've always learned to keep my life private, and that really helped me and served me because I didn't like to talk about my personal life anyway, right? And so I think that it was very easy for me to have this blank slate with clients and like keep my life very private. And now I'm going and starting my own show, and now the whole world is going to know about who I really am, right? Who I really am. And so, of course I had these doubts of like, what are people going to think of me? Are they going to still view me as a professional? Are they going to hate me? Are they going to hate everything that I'm saying on this show? And it was also a really huge learning opportunity for me to discover what my voice was. I think that, the first episode, I tried my best to be as real and authentic as I could, but I think I was still trying to navigate, like, what is my voice here on this show? Like, and I think now I'm sort of at the point where I'm like, okay, I've found my voice. I know how I want to show up on this podcast and in this space. And yeah, I think at the beginning, it's definitely really scary. And I think it's normal to have imposter syndrome and have all these doubts.
Absolutely. Yeah. We actually, in our academy, we talk a lot about the burnt pancake theory. Like those first few episodes, you are figuring out like what are the ingredients, and your pan's going to be too hot and you're going to burn the edges. And there's always the burnt pancake for the first, like so many of them. But eventually you're going to get to that really pretty Waffle House pancake.
Love that. Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in your podcast, you have this really unique way of blending like education and lived experience and practical tools. How did you develop that approach?
Yeah. So,
Or how many pancakes did you burn?
ooh, many. The amount of times that I've had to re-record my episodes because I'm like, it has to be perfect. But there's no such thing as perfect.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
I think educating was really like the easy part for me. So I think I started off with trying to just share my like the education, the tips, the tools, and that just came more naturally for me. I think what didn't come so naturally for me was sharing my personal stories. And so it was really trying to kind of dip my toes into sharing bits and pieces of who I was while still educating. So I think I would start by educating, which I felt so comfortable doing, and then like dipping my toes and sharing and like, oh, and I've also experienced this in my personal life. And so it was just kind of trial and error, what felt right, what didn't feel right. And now I can sort of do a full episode sharing more of like my story because it's practice. Over time, I've learned like, okay, it's okay to just share my story and my side of things. But I think I started off with what I felt comfortable with and slowly started to step outside of my comfort zone.
Yeah, and it takes time, right? Like we can't go into these beginning episodes thinking, I am going to go save the world with this podcast. I know all the things that I need to know. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, 1000%. Yeah. I think I kept reminding myself, even if one person listens to this episode, that's
Yeah.
one person who is getting a different perspective. And that's one person who is learning something new. And so I needed to remind myself it's not about the metrics. It's not about how many people are, watching or listening. It's just the people who are going to benefit in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that is so cool. That is so cool. So your podcast makes trauma healing accessible, right? Without requiring people to relive or to discuss their trauma. So can you share an example of how you structure an episode to be able to achieve that?
Yeah. So I really I like to, and I talk about this in almost all of my episodes. I like to repeat myself over and over again, especially because sometimes there are people who are just listening to my episode for the very first time and haven't heard previous episodes. And so I really like to educate on the nervous system and what trauma is and do a little refresher in every episode, and then diving into, okay, now that we understand what trauma is, now that we understand how the nervous system functions, how can we support the nervous system so that we can move out of these survival states? And so it's doing a little bit of the education, and then how can we take action, right? So laying out the somatic tools, how can we connect to the body? And I kind of usually follow that same structure for all of my episodes. And again, just kind of sharing my personal story so that people listening can apply it to their own lives, right? I think it's easier when you hear somebody's story and say, oh, okay, that makes sense. And now I understand how the role of the nervous system is kind of playing out in my daily life.
That's really interesting. And I like too that you don't assume that just because you said it once or twice in your podcast, that all the people that now are listening will know that, because you never know where people drop in. And so having that like consistent message and consistent structure would be really helpful to welcome new people to your podcast and not say, okay, if you want to know what I'm about, go back to episode 1 and binge, because some people do that. A lot of people don't.
Totally. Yeah. I do like to mention other episodes in the podcast,
Yes.
in the episode, but it's not like, all right, you have to start from the beginning.
Yeah.
No, it's like you will get the information in every episode.
Yeah, like start back at chapter 1. There'll be a quiz on Friday.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
And
go
like
ahead.
the nervous system and trauma is like such a it's simple and complicated at the same time. And so I feel like no matter how many times you hear someone say something about the nervous system or trauma, it's like, okay, like everybody needs that refresher. Even I need that refresher sometimes.
Yeah. And I would imagine too that sometimes you're just not ready to hear it. Like you could hear the same message 5 times, but if you're not ready to hear it until like the 4th or 5th time, it may just go straight over your head or past you.
Yeah, 1000%. It's just like reading a book, right? Sometimes you have to reread the same page over and over again. Same thing with podcasts.
Yeah, definitely. So podcasting, I tell a lot of my students it's a very intimate medium, right? Because we're like in our ears. You're in somebody's ears for a long period of time. So have you ever had any moments where like a listener's feedback really reinforced why you do this work and kind of the intimacy of working with people?
Yes. You know, I think that no matter how many episodes I've recorded, there's still a little bit of doubt that tends to creep in. And there are moments where I'm like, is anyone even listening? Does anyone even care? Right? All of these things, all of these
Yeah.
narratives. And I do end up getting beautiful feedback from my audience saying, you inspire me. I can't wait to be doing the things that you're doing one day. You're inspiring me to become a therapist. You're inspiring me to start my own podcast. And it's those moments where I realize, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, of like, it doesn't matter how many people are actually listening. It's that one person who is going to feel inspired and who it's really going to touch and make a difference, right? And so I think it's that feedback is what really fuels me to keep going.
Yeah.
It's my motivator, and I've screenshotted all of these comments just as a reminder for myself, because
Yeah.
it reminds me to keep going on the days where I'm like, oh, I have to record a podcast. I have to record. I like remember that no, there are people who listen every week. There are people who are waiting to hear what I have to say. And I think it's so important because it is an intimate, like we are connected, even if we've never met, right? In person or through a virtual call, there is a connection there because they know my story. They've been listening to me weekly, or they've been following my journey. And yeah, it's just like a beautiful thing. You never know who you're going to impact, who you're going to inspire.
Yes, absolutely. And I love, so in our talk today, because this is a podcast about podcasting, like teaching people how to podcast, I love that you haven't said, despite that we started up with such hiccups too on our technology, but nothing that you've said has been about the tech. And I love that because over and over and over, I tell my students it's the least important part of all the stuff that you're going to do with podcasting. It is the least important part. You'll figure it out. That part will get figured out. But if you don't have a good story and like a reason for your podcast, you're not going to make it past a few podcast episodes because you're not going to know what to talk about. You're not going to know who you're talking to. And I love that everything that you've talked with us about today has all been about other, the story that you're telling and how you're helping others and what you're doing with this podcast, which I think is the most important thing that you can learn when you're learning to podcast is who you're speaking to or who you're trying to serve and what story you're continuously telling along the way. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. It's not about the tech. It's about the story.
It's not about the tech, no. And I, to this day, don't have anything fancy. When I first started, I was recording in my closet.
Yeah.
And
that is a great place to record. Yeah.
Yes,
it's a great place.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean, I don't record in my closet anymore, but I still don't have anything fancy. Like I use my basic sound recorder on my laptop. I don't have any fancy, I don't know, tech thingies on my, like I haven't downloaded anything. I don't pay for anything. I think, it can be really simple as long, like you can do it on your phone. It doesn't matter where you record, as long, you don't even need a fancy microphone or anything.
No.
Because people don't really care about those things.
Nope, not at all. And when we jumped on today, we have, I have a fancy-ish mic. It looks fancier than it is. But, and you just said that you don't have all of the like bells and whistles downloaded. And whose mic worked right out of the box? Not mine. Yours.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
So it doesn't matter. And I love that. And that's one thing that I want to stress in like every episode that I have from here on out is it's the least important part. You have to know like what you want to say and that the story is more important than anything else. Like what's the story and what's your point?
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, or you mentioned when we were writing back and forth that consistency matters more than perfection. And I love that sentiment. I agree with you 1000%. So was there anything that like, had you personally learned that lesson or what advice would you give to podcasters struggling with consistency?
Yeah. And I'll be honest, I was struggling with consistency and
it's so hard.
It's so hard. Right. And I think that, it goes back to, I think part of my lack of consistency at the very beginning was feeling like it needed to be perfect. I needed to get out a really perfect episode and it needed to benefit and it needed to hit all of the points, right? And I struggled with that because I didn't want to be repetitive and I wanted people to get the most out of listening to my episodes. But now I've realized that, again, going back to maybe I've said this before, but it's not about that. It's about, the new person listening who's joining at, episode 100 or whatever it is, allowing myself to just get it out without trying to overthink it, without trying to be perfect. So if I'm struggling, if I'm like, oh, there's an episode that needs to be released tomorrow, what am I going to do? I see if I can take a topic that I've already talked about and how can I simplify this or how can I say it in a different way? That way, it's not something that I'm repeating myself on, but I'm just sharing a different perspective on the same topic, and then it gets it out, right? And the other thing that I think I struggled with is like, oh, it needs to be a certain length. And reminding myself it just needs to get out. It doesn't matter if it's 15 minutes. It's okay if it's 7 minutes long. Like, that will be okay. And then maybe next week's episode can be a little bit longer, and it doesn't have to be the same every week. So again, it really is something that I've had to learn how to be okay with and learn how to navigate. But the consistency part, definitely, it was hard at the beginning.
Yeah, there was so much in what you just said. Listeners don't care. They don't care about the length. They don't. They could care less about the length. And I think a lot of us get hung up on that, because I was too. It's like, why, it's got to be at least 15 minutes, 30 optimally. An hour is a little bit too long for what I do, but at least 15. And that I would spend, for a half an hour episode, I would spend like 4 hours editing. And that's just ridiculous, and it's not sustainable.
No.
Perfection paralysis made, oh my gosh, it made such, I was so scared to get started and to just do things. Because one, also being a teacher in interactive media, I was like, what if my students listen to this and theirs are so much better? And what are they going to think of mine? And how can I teach this if mine's not good? And just like these stupid excuses we give ourselves, which I think all go back to imposter syndrome and a little insecurity. It's
1000%.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
and I think the other part of it that played a role into it was like the editing piece. It's like, oh my gosh, I have to edit out all of the ums, all of the silences, all of the stutters. And then I realized like that is taking up so much of my time. And it's okay if I just talk like a normal human being and stutter and have silences, and it's going to feel more intimate that way, because when you're in conversation with someone, you don't speak perfectly. And so it's giving yourself permission to be imperfect.
Absolutely. I actually was doing the same thing, and that's what was one of the reasons it was taking me like 4 hours per every episode. Because I didn't realize how much I like go off on tangents and say and all of these things. But then a professor that I was working with, and he was a music producer before he became a professor, and he was like the main music producer for the Bee Gees, and he's worked with like Celine Dion and all of these huge names. And he was like, no, why are you taking these things out? Nobody, like, maybe if every other word is like or something like that, yeah, take some of them out. But just natural speech, he's like, everybody, like, no, in a podcast, nobody expects anything different. Nobody's going to notice if you take all of those out. Why are you spending 4 hours on this?
Totally.
Yes.
Totally.
And I'm like, well, okay, if it's good enough for the Bee Gees, then I am not doing that anymore.
1000%. Yeah. And when we think about podcasting and we think about that human connection that we're trying to achieve, right? Nobody really connects with a perfect human, right?
No.
If it was so polished and perfect, then the person on the other side listening is going to feel a little like, oh, maybe that person isn't for me. Maybe this podcast isn't for me. They're going to feel self-conscious, and we don't want to make our audience feel self-conscious. We want to empower them and make them feel inspired. And so I think that allowing yourself to be imperfect gives the listener permission to be imperfect as well.
Absolutely. I love that. So you're not putting yourself above people, and you're not saying it's okay to know a little. In a lot of the business groups that I'm in, they talk about that 10% edge, like have a little bit of an edge just so you can actually show that you've gone through this and you can teach people how to do it. But you don't have to know everything before you get started. And that to me applies very much to podcasting too. You don't have to know everything. Done is better than perfect. And I completely agree. Perfect can be off-putting. It can be, because we know it's not real.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. So what's next for She's Resilient? She is Resilient. Excuse me. Any exciting episodes or projects that you have coming up?
Well, it's funny. I just recorded an episode with my husband, and
Okay.
that's a first. And I was like, "Ooh, like let's see how this," because again, it's showing that human side of me, and I think that there was a little bit of educating, but it was also fun and silly, and
Yeah.
we laughed a lot, which is
Oh,
something that She is Resilient doesn't like. We are very much talking about serious topics, and so I thought, having my husband on would give it a little spin and just like switch things up a little bit. So I'm trying to just experiment with She is Resilient and
fun.
see like what, I don't know, wherever it takes us.
I love that. I love that because I would, and this is me just projecting, so I don't know for sure, but I would imagine speaking about trauma, it would be hard. So having the ability to laugh and have that kind of different take, at least occasionally, would be, I would imagine, just not relaxing. That's not the right word, but a relief, or
Yeah,
I don't. I'm not
totally.
sure the right word for it.
Yeah, I would definitely say relief, right? Because we need to heal trauma, to
Yeah,
heal the nervous system. We need play. We need to laugh,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
It can't all be all serious all of the time.
Right. And it's kind of practicing what your whole podcast is about too, because you talked about completing the circle. So if you're constantly trauma, 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 do you ever complete the circle in that way? So
Right.
being able to come and laugh and do some different things, and
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
very
So
cool.
I'm just trying to have fun. I'm trying to be completely raw and transparent with
Yeah.
my audience. And I actually just deleted my social media. So She is Resilient is sort of like my primary way. I was using social media a lot to kind of update my audience and share all of these thoughts and reflections. And I was very present on social media, but now that I've deleted it completely, She is Resilient is sort of my way of connecting with my audience in a different way. So I am trying to experiment a little bit more with She is Resilient.
I love that. That is so powerful. There's so much interesting research. And that's what I started in. I started as a social media researcher. I was looking at domestic violence and how people that were coming out of those situations were able to gain support, or networks of support and information. This was when the internet wasn't totally new, but we were really starting to realize like what the internet could do, and social was really starting to happen on it. So it was like in 2003, four. So it's pretty early in
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
the social aspect of it. Yeah. But so the research on what social media can do to our brains is really interesting. It is such a double-edged sword.
Yeah, 1000%. Yeah. I
Do you
think
feel better having deleted? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh my gosh. No, that's a great question. I feel so liberated
Yeah.
leaving social media, and which is really hard because I had a pretty large audience. I was on there every day. I was very consistent with social media. It almost became second nature for me to create content, and yeah, it was a very much part of my life and my routine. And at first it was really scary to leave, but now, even though I loved creating content and I loved showing up on social media, I do feel liberated in a way.
Yeah.
I almost feel like, wow, I have so much time to do other things, and I have so much time to focus on things that maybe I wasn't allowing myself to do because I was consumed by social media. And again, I used it primarily for business related purposes, but
Yeah.
I think that it did become like an everyday. I was kind of like glued to my phone, but now I'm like, oh wow, I don't have to check my Instagram. I don't have to check my notifications or my DMs. I It really does feel freeing in a way.
Yeah. That is so cool. That is so cool. I actually would love to like message in like a month or so and be like, so how you still feel? Is it great? Because it's something I've been kind of like teasing. A lot of the researchers that I worked with, they'll take like a detox month every summer and just go, I'm
Mhm.
going dark. And they will delete all of their accounts off their phone. They'll not delete their accounts off like the platform, but like off their phone. And so they can't even be tempted to get to it. And they're like, it's
Yeah.
the best thing I could do for myself every year. So I at
Yeah.
least wanted to start doing something like that. I think it would be
Yeah.
resetting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1000%. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Where can listeners connect with you and learn more about your work? I
Yeah.
guess
So they can.
she is resilient.
Yes, she is resilient. Come hang out with me on She is Resilient. I also have a free community that you can join. We meet monthly and we can also connect on there. But She is Resilient is the primary way that you can hang out with me. And I have all of like my links there. And I'm sure I'll share those links with Dr.
Yes.
Stephanie. But yeah,
They'll
I
be in the
think
show
that,
notes for sure.
yeah. Okay, wonderful. So everything will be in the show notes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so you can connect with me primarily on the podcast.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your patience for the gremlins that we had in the beginning. And I did not feed them. It's not after midnight. I don't know what happened. I, I definitely
No
appreciate
worries.
your time and everything
Of
for sure.
course. Yeah, of course.